Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. I'd like to quickly mention we are on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. There are 4 tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. There's a ton of great benefits, but the best benefit for you is inclusion on the History of the Papacy diptychs, which in traditional Christianity is the list of bishops commemorated in the order of their precedence. So the sooner you sign up for Patreon, the higher on the list you will be. Now let us commemorate the History of the Papacy patrons. On the History of the Papacy diptychs, we have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah. At the Alexandria level, we have Dapo, Paul, Justine, Lana, and John, all of whom are magnificent. At the Constantinople level, and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. Today we are joined by Giada Lattanzio, who is a scholar of late antiquity and medieval Byzantine history. She has a specialty in the areas in particular of art history and fashion. Giada will share with us some ideas of clothing, art depictions of clothing, and fashion during the era we are discussing in this Celtic Christianity series. She will guide us through the development of liturgical clothing. I think you will very much enjoy this extra bit of context for the fascinating period of church and papal history we are talking about. With that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Thank you, Giada, for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk about this really fascinating topic of fashion in history and in antiquity. I really appreciate you coming on to talk to us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to your podcast. I really appreciate it.
Now, Giada Lattanzio is our guest today, and she graduated in medieval and Byzantine history at Ca' Foscari University in Venice, Italy. And during her master's degree, she did an internship at the Center for Early Medieval Studies in Brno, Czech Republic, for the journal Convivium, Exchanges and Interactions in the Arts of Medieval Europe, Byzantium, and the Mediterranean. And she is now starting her PhD as well in the Czech Republic. Her research focuses on early medieval art, especially Byzantine art, but her interests include applied arts, fashion history, and their interconnections with art. Now, just to briefly give the genesis of this episode, I had a conversation with Dr. Carly McNamara in our series about the Irish and the Celts in Christianity. And we had both recalled reading that the Celts invented trousers. And I contacted Dr. Justine de Young, a professor of history at the Fashion Institute of New York, who told me that in a very polite way, she said that's completely wrong, but she suggested I contact Giada for more information on fashion and clothing during antiquity and the Middle Ages. Now, I thought maybe to get started, how did you become interested in the history of fashion and art?
Well, from a young age, I was very interested in fashion and in the history of costume. And I thought I've decided to focus my studies on art history. I continue to dedicate myself to the study of the costume, of history of costume, and particularly on the medieval period. So thanks to the Fashion History Timeline project I work on, I've been able to, let's say, combine these two interests, so art and fashion, yes, history of costume.
What is the area that you particularly focus on, or maybe an area in your PhD studies that you want to focus in on particularly?
So as I focus my art history studies on the early medieval period, my knowledge mainly concerns the costume of this period. So from the end of the 4th century until the 10th century. Because for the later period, I've only analyzed the Byzantine imperial costume between the 13th and 15th century. And the areas of my concern are the regions which were under the Byzantine Empire, mostly, and the Mediterranean more in general.
What can you tell us maybe some basic overview of what type of clothing did people wear during the early medieval period, late antiquity?
Yes. So, firstly, I want to point out that I will especially talk about the elite attire. But essentially, during Antiquity, men wore the toga over a tunic. So the toga was a long piece of cloth, which was arranged in folds and draped over the shoulders and around the body. Then the women wore the stola, which was a pleated dress, which was usually tied at the waist. So these garments were usually made of plain undyed fabric, and commonly they were made of wool or linen. As a mantle, they wore, men and also women, the palla, which was a kind of cape used to cover the head in certain circumstances, such as religious ceremonies. This habit to use palla during religious ceremonies was linked to the Roman world. So in the first centuries after Christ, its use was banned, and so the clergy didn't want to use this pagan, let's say, garment. Then the Roman costume became the model for the late antique and early medieval clothing. So thanks to figurative sources, such as diptychs, we can see that the toga was used more or less until the 5th century. So it was slightly different from the one worn in Antiquity, because this toga had a wider balteus, which was the section hanging down the left side of the body, and which was again pulled out over the shoulder. For example, at the diptych of Constans III, which came from Rome and is dated to the 417, the consul is depicted on the recto, so in the front of the diptych with the triumphal toga. And on the verso, he wears a chlamys as a patrician. So in this diptych, we have the representation of the two outfits adopted by the elite during this period, during the 15th century. The 5th century, sorry. And in the 4th century, a Greco-Roman cloak was adopted, and it was constantly used in the following centuries. And this was the chlamys. So this was an ankle-length cloak, usually pinned by a brooch or fibula on the right shoulder. So this was the basic garment of the uniform worn by soldiers, high member of the court, and also civilian administration. And this uniform consists of this chlamys over a tight sleeve tunic with a belt. So because it was typically used by Roman soldiers or emperor, the chlamys became the most widely used garment to represent imperial power. This until the 7th century in the Byzantine Empire and until at least the 10th century in the West. So it was especially used by emperors to legitimize their power and to show their connection with the great Roman Empire of the Antiquity. Then there was the tunic, and it is a garment that we can see represented throughout the medieval period, and I would say that it never disappeared. There were many variants of this garment. They could be long or short or ankle length, but we are every time talking about essentially of the same garment. Speaking of women's wear, there were essentially tunics and loose-fitting dresses, which in some cases couldn't be tied at the waist. But there are some exceptions because, for example, the Empress Theodora and the Empress Ariadne, we are speaking of the 5th to 6th century. These two empresses were portrayed on diptychs, Ariadne on a diptych and Theodora in the Mosaic of San Vitale in Ravenna. So they wore the chlamys. And the chlamys was essentially a male garment. So it's it's a very interesting exception, this because these two empresses were represented with a male garment, but probably because it was they wanted to represent the imperial power. The ordinary costume of an aristocratic woman is only attested in an early diptych of Stilicho, where his wife Serena is depicted. And in her portrait, she wore two tunics, an inner tunic with long tight fitting sleeves and a wider tunic over it. And he, for example, he wore the palla, of which I mentioned earlier, which was this cloth which could be used to cover the head. But for the late antique and early medieval period, we don't have so much information about the women's wear, because mostly were men's, which were represented in figurative sources. Then there were also the trousers, like trousers or leggings. So you asked me about their origins, and I think it's really hard to know who invented or first used them, because we can certainly say that trousers have been used in different cultures, places, and time. So as early as the 6th century BC, their existence is attested among Iranian people, along with Eastern and Central Asian people. So the use of trousers was essentially linked to the domestication of horses that began in these areas. The sources attest two types of trousers, which were the Anaxirides and the Sarabara, and both were considered by Greeks as a mark of barbarians. So people wearing these trousers were considered as barbarians. So the Anaxirides were tight-fitting trousers that resembled tights, and in the 5th and 6th century were worn tight-fitting trousers that also covered the foot, called tibialia, which can be considered the evolution of these Anaxirides. The tibialia were worn by soldiers and emperors of both Eastern and Western armies, with campaggi, which is a kind of shoes that maybe we can speak later. And as we can see, and we can see the representation of the tibialia also in the San Vitale mosaics in Ravenna. The other type of trousers, which are the Sarabara, instead were loose fitting trousers. And it seems that from figurative sources in early medieval period, in both East and West High Court members or emperors wore these tight-fitting trousers, such as tibialia, and instead Eastern and Northern people wore loose-fitting trousers. So Roman sources mention the adoption of a type of trousers or leg coverings by Celts called brache. These trousers were not tight but loose-fitting, and they resemble knickerbocker and were usually made of wool and fastened by drawstrings. So although the Romans and Greeks considered trousers to be a garment only worn by barbarians, leg coverings were worn also by Roman soldiers, especially during military campaigns when extra warmth or protection was required. So they probably wore these short breeches or leg coverings, such as puttees or leg bindings, which were wrapped and tied around the legs. So in Antiquity, to summarize, there were the Anaxirides, which were tight-fitting trousers, worn by East and Central Asian people, and probably they are the ancestors, we can say, of the tibialia, which will be used in the early medieval period. Then there were the Sarabara, which can be also considered as the ancestors of the brache, which were loose-fitting trousers. But the brache were used by the Celts, or these barbarians, as the Romans called them. And we can assume that these trousers were a sewn garment, while Romans and Greeks wore pieces of cloth that were wrapped and tied around the legs, such as the puttees or other leg bindings. So I hope that I know that it's a lot, but I hope that it could be a good overview from the Romans. So it's like the passage through the late antiquity, from the Roman late antiquity, and then the first centuries of the early medieval period.
And now a word from our sponsors. Yeah, that's great. And I think it shows that evolution for sure, and the mixing of cultures. I'm wondering, before we move on, you, as a scholar of fashion and clothing, when you're looking at that, are you mostly relying on art, or are there some physical examples of clothing that are still extant?
Well, mostly I used figurative sources, so art, yes, because we don't have so much garment. Well, there are a few material evidence in museums, so it's really difficult to. Well, in general, it's really difficult to study clothing of this period because we don't have so much material evidence, and also because sometimes the figurative sources can be misunderstood, or maybe they didn't represent the reality. I mean, the real clothes that they wore at that time. So yes, essentially I use art, but yes, we have to use many different sources. So written sources when is possible, the few material evidence, and also art, because sometimes it really helps to see how these garments were also used at the time, or probably used at the time.
What do we know about the differences in the clothing people wore in different climates and geographical areas? Generally, it's warmer in the Mediterranean region, but it gets fairly cold not too far north. How did people adjust for that? Were there specific garments for that?
Well, I would say that for colder seasons, they used garments made of wool, probably, instead of cotton or linen. And probably they also used some kind of underwear. So, for example, there were this linea or camision, which was an inner tunic. So probably they were more layers, I would say, of garment. But yes, it depends of the area that we are talking about, because, for example, I'm not an expert of the northern areas, so I don't know for these areas, but probably they use also fur or other materials like this. But for the Mediterranean area, I would say just this, so that the garments were made of wool, probably, and that they use more layers of garments for the colder seasons.
You mentioned a little bit about shoes. What type of footwear was available for someone in this time period?
So we don't know much about shoes, but thanks to figurative sources and little material evidence, we can see that the most common type of shoes used in both East and West during late antiquity were campaggi. And these were a kind of sandals used by soldiers, but also civilians. And they were made of wool, but probably also of leather. And these cover only the toes and the heel, so leaving the upper instep uncovered. And thanks to the laces, they were tied up at the instep. Then there were also some kind of boots, which were usually used in military clothing. For example, calce, which were ankle boots used through the 5th, 6th centuries, or the zangia, which were red purple leather footwear of Oriental origin. We know something also of the speaking of antiquity, we know that the Romans used essentially sandals, leather or wooden soled sandals. And for example, soldiers used the calige, which were leather shoes laced at the front. But yes, essentially, I would say that in late antiquity and early medieval period, they used essentially some kind of sandals, and also they used some kind of socks, which are called udones, because for example, in colder season, probably they need also these socks because they were wearing only sandals. So
as much as can be determined from the sources, what were maybe some of the major differences between the clothing of social classes?
Well, I consider the costume as a social marker. So I would say that, like today, clothing was used to define differences between groups of people and classes. So an example of the attempt to represent different cultures through costume is the Barberini diptych, which is dated to the early 6th century, where 4 men are depicted in the lower part. And scholars have recognized these men as the representation of the provinces of the Byzantine Empire, offering donations to the emperor as a sign of submission. And for example, the 2 men on the left are recognized as Persians or Sacians because they wore a Phrygian cap, which it was a conical cap with the apex bent over. And that was part of the Persian costume during the 4th and 2nd century BC. And on the right side, the men recognized as Indians are bare chest and wear only a cloth around their waist. So thanks to the costume, we can recognize the people which were represented here in the diptych. But artists of this diptych decided to represent them with these costumes because they communicate to the observer their ethnicity and from where they came from. But we have also to keep in mind that people were represented through stereotypes. So when we analyze a figurative source or an artwork, we have to keep in mind that because, for example, earlier when I talk about cells who were usually represented with loose-fitting trousers, but it doesn't mean that they only wore this kind of garments. Or maybe probably we also have to keep in mind that because obviously they connect the fact that as barbarians they could only wear this kind of garments, and the same is also for the Phrygian cap in the Barberini diptych. But in general, in antiquity and the Middle Ages, so there was a dress code, and clothing was strictly regulated to identify the rank, the ethnicity, the profession, and the gender of the wearer. And also in written sources, the names of certain garments were used metaphorically to define certain political, social, or religious role. For example, the toga with the togati. So the togati were the people who wore toga. And as we have already mentioned, people who wore loose-fitting trousers were considered as barbarians, or an emperor had to wear the typical military attire, so the chlamys, the campaggi, the intibialia. So since portraits of this period were usually from elite groups, we don't have the possibility to make a true comparison with a non-elite dress. And obviously the reason is that the commissioners which wanted to be depicted came from the aristocracy or the imperial family. So consequently, most of studies have dealt with elite and how they saw and depict themselves, while depictions of non-elite dress are very rare. Another differentiating element was the fabric, probably, of the clothes, because we can certainly say that the difference was also marked by an economic reason. So, which means that the most precious fabrics were intended only for the aristocracy and imperial families, So the attempt was to make the social status coincide with the availability of financial resources. And the control of the economic system represent the desire to bring order into society through this hierarchy, where the preciousness symbolized the rank and also the social importance of the wearer. For example, in the Byzantine Empire, had the control of the Byzantine silk production and also the control of the production and use of purple dye.
Would children have generally worn similar clothing to adults? Do we know much about if they had specific dress that they wore?
Well, in general, there weren't so many differences. And usually children use the same garments as the adults. So yes, their garments were essentially the same of the adults. So we are talking about tunics or dresses or cloaks, but there weren't so many differences. Also between men and women, we can say probably that the men usually wore shorter tunics, and that women wore dresses, but it was not so evident the difference during these centuries.
As far as colors go, did they have a wide palette to choose from, either from a practical standpoint or a fashion standpoint?
Well, colors, the color has always played an important role in defining social status, as the process of dyeing or bleaching was very expensive in terms of time and resources. So the brighter or more intense the color, the more valuable the fabric, which was intended for the court or the imperial family. Especially purple, which was a secretion produced by Amberley, was the imperial color par excellence, and its production, sale, and use were regulated since the Tudor Empire. And from the 5th century onwards, guilds were established, and these guilds produced purple dye and dyed textiles. And gold was another important color that, together with purple, was the color used to present Christ and his delegate on earth, who was the emperor. But in general, the most commonly used colors up to the early medieval period were red, purple, or red, white, blue, yellow, but often the fabrics were also undyed. So they weren't maybe a bright and white, but they were undyed. The range of colors then increased in the following centuries, and thanks to the improvement of dyeing techniques and also to trade, because it allowed new patterns and decorations to be introduced. Speaking of dyeing techniques, these have been known since ancient times, and these are attested at least by the first millennium BC. So dyes were usually extracted from plants, such as madder for red, vald for yellow, and woad for blue. But also insects, or for example, other animals like the murex were used to extract a color. And the fabrics were dyed with these colors, and thanks also to the mordant, which was a substance used during the dyeing process to fix the color. And varying the proportion of mordant can vary the depth of color obtained. So the fabrics essentially were immersed in vats with water, the dye, which was previously extracted, and the mordant. So this procedure was repeated several times until the desired color or shade was obtained.
Was there any evidence of clothing retailers or specialists, merchants who dealt in fashion and clothing?
Well, it's difficult to answer to your question because we don't have enough written sources, which can give us information about this production. But I would say that there was especially the trade of fibers as wool. And then within a group of people, there was someone who could weave and produce the cloth for making garments. Because for these centuries, as far as I know, there wasn't a real trade of ready-made garments. Probably this kind of trade probably started in the following centuries, not in the early medieval period.
In your studies in this time period of late antiquity going into the medieval period, were there any major innovations in clothing technology?
Well, speaking of fabrics and fibers, wool was the most commonly used fiber, but among the plant fibers, linen and hemp were also widely used. Then the silk was one of the most precious fiber used to make clothes for the aristocracy and imperial family. And sericulture could be considered as a new technology because it was introduced in Byzantium probably in the 6th century during the Justinian Empire. So this production and techniques were imported from China, and written sources tell us that the Byzantines were able to learn about sericulture and to stole some silkworms, and thanks to that they started to produce silk in Constantinople. But in the 6th century, there were also new techniques, such as loom weaving, which were introduced to produce fabric with more ornamental patterns and to create more shaped and fit garments. So during this period, there was the draw loom, which was a hand loom for weaving figures, textiles, and it was equipped with a so-called figure harness. And thanks to that, it could be possible to control some or all the wrap threads, and allows the automatic repetition of a pattern, both horizontally and vertically. So thanks to this new loom, it was possible to make more elaborate decorations or motifs, and the weavers were able to reproduce and imitate Sasanian textiles and decoration, such as the roundel motif or figures, as evidenced by material and figurative evidence. Sasanian textiles, this particular type of precious fabrics, were also highly evaluated in the West and were used to wrap relics, which is why most of these textiles have been found in churches, and now they are in different Western museums.
Would that have also made it more be able to produce more cloth more quickly, these new looms, or was it more for making them more elaborate?
Well, this new draw loom, it only allowed to create more elaborate decorations and motifs, but not to make it more easier, or the procedure, it was not more efficient in time resources. So because every time there was the weaver, so there was every time a person who had to use this draw loom. If the production, when we are speaking of a more efficient production in terms of time, we are talking about really the 17th centuries. So during the medieval period, it was always a really long procedure in terms of time. So it wasn't faster than earlier.
Now, this is maybe going into more textual evidence, but was there a sense of fashion? Did people, I mean, if we think in the modern era, there's some pull towards having new and innovative clothing, and then some pull towards going back to tradition. Did people in antiquity think this way, that you have to have the latest, this season's fashions?
Well, if you mean fashion as intended today, I would say that it was completely different, and probably the term fashion is not an appropriate word to talk about this period, because we are talking about a society in which personal freedom was limited compared to today, and we can see it also in clothing. And this is because clothes were the material extension of the person, so they indicate the gender and social status. So it was important how people show themselves in society. So when you ask me if clothing was a way of representing themselves, I will say yes and no, because yes, they represent who they are, but adopting the social code of the time. So during antiquity, a soldier would not have worn a toga like a consul would have worn a military cloak. So I would say that fashion and fashion industry, as we intended today, starts between at least the 15th, 16th century. So when the production of clothing and fabrics became really huge, we can think about Flanders or Florence in Italy. So it was necessary to produce and offer new products for the bourgeoisie, who also through clothing could show their new social status, and this allowed the textile industries to grow and to expand their businesses. So during late antiquity and the early medieval period, we are in a very different situation where only the imperial family or aristocracy could wear precious fabrics or certain colors. And the common people could not wear what they wanted, apparently. So the use of certain type of clothing was linked to an economic reason, but also to its symbolic value.
And now a word from our sponsors. How much clothing would a person have as in the modern day, because of inexpensive manufacturing, we have closets and drawers full of clothing. In this time period, how many maybe outfits, you might say, would a person have?
Well, speaking of commoners, and yes, probably didn't have so many garments, and the material evidence show us that people create also new garments reusing old fabrics. So there is evidence of darning, patching, and mending of many of late antique garments and garments fragment.
A really interesting aspect of this is liturgical dress, where we see that in your article, you go into a lot of detail about the mosaic in San Vitale and the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna. And there's a picture of a bishop or a representation rather of a bishop. Would the clothing that a church person wear, was it dramatically different than what another high status person would have worn?
Well, at the beginning, there weren't differences because the clergy adopt the Roman costume. But at some point, the Christian clergy decided to adopt some type of garments and to define their uniform. And that's why at the end of the 4th century, the clerical orders decided to define which kind of garments should wear. And the garments should have different appearance from the one of the pagan Roman ministers. So the Roman Church was concerned in eliminating every visual reference linked to the pagan world. And despite the clergy condemned the use of precious textiles and of purple dye fabrics because they were associated to imperial officials, soldiers, and Roman ministers, the Christian clergy adopted the civil Roman costume and readapted to the new needs. So essentially, there were three main garments which were used by the clergy. The first is the chasuble or the casula, which was a variation of the penula, which it was a cloak similar to a poncho worn over the tunic and with an opening for the head. Then also the clergy wore a kind of tunic but this typical sacerdotal clothing was called alba, and it was usually made of white linen. A variation of this tunic was the dalmatica with thin purple bands, which decorated the tunic from the shoulders to the rim and the hem sleeves. Then there was the pallium, which was a stripe of white cloth. This ecclesiastical vestment was used since the 6th century, and we can see in the San Vitale church, where there is the portrait of the Archbishop Maximianus, who wore this pallium. And this vestment and the dalmatic were usually worn by deacons. And they became a prestigious attire also because deacons were personalities extremely powerful in the Roman Church. And probably the pallium derived from the one worn by philosophers, and in early representation of apostles, we can see also this kind of garment. In the East, we have this difference between the emperor and the clergy, but not so much, because, for example, there was a garment called sakkos, which was a tunic with white sleeves, and it was originally worn by the emperor as an imperial vestment, symbolizing the tunic of disgrace worn by Christ during his trial and mockery. But then the sakkos was used by the bishop, and also today bishop wore this kind of garment. Obviously, it changed over the time, probably a bit, but the sakkos, yes, was used also during the Byzantine Empire.
How did liturgical vestments evolve through time, going into where they began in Antiquity? Did they change very much going forward?
Well, I would say not so much, but yes, probably. For example, the pallium, which is like the stole today, it became more thin because at the beginning was a wider piece of cloth. But yes, essentially, the garments didn't change so much. The real change was when the clergy adopted the Roman costume at the beginning, and then it readapted these garments, and the clergy modified it to create this new, we can say, uniform for the clergy. But I would say that it didn't change so much through the following centuries.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I have learned so much about this topic, and I know there's much, much, much more to learn. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.